Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, this EIC webinar. My name is Matthew Farrow. I'm the director here at EIC, and this is the third and final of our webinar series on green data for this period. We do these webinars in conjunction with the Natural Environment Research Council, and I'm very grateful to their support. And they're part of our Green Data initiative, which aims to bring together businesses, academia and policymakers to explore the opportunities that digitalisation is bringing to environmental policy and practice. So the focus of today's webinar is on environmental data and the future of planning. Now, planning reform to me seems a bit like football World Cups. They come around every few years. There's a lot of hype in the build-up, but the outcome, from an England point of view at least, doesn't always match up to that hype. And like most previous reforms, ministers in this round of planning reform, they're looking to do two things: to speed up the planning system, but at the same time to make it more open, more fair and accessible. Having said that, I think there are two pieces of context, if you like, which do make it a bit different this time. And those two pieces of context are the theme for today's webinar. One of those is the fact that at the same time the government is talking about these planning reforms, it also has an extremely ambitious environmental agenda covering obviously net zero, but also things like biodiversity net gain, the Dasgupta review of biodiversity, economics, air quality, pretty much all environmental topics. And alongside that as well, we're also seeing across all parts of business and the economy a real digital transformation as everyone moves to look at data, the uses of data, online activity and digitalization. So we've got three speakers today who are going to give us their perspective on this context and how that's going to affect planning reform and the environmental agenda in particular. Just before I introduce the speakers, I've got a couple of housekeeping points to make. One is that if you want to ask questions, please do that. You can use the chat function in the control panel. You can ask the questions throughout the webinar while our speakers are presenting if there's things they're saying that trigger a thought or a question. And then when we come to Q&A at the end, we'll answer as many as we can. We're going to record the webinar and upload it to our website. So if you miss anything, you'll be able to see it again later on. Okay, on that note, we'll turn to our first speaker. So I'd like to introduce James Harris. James is a policy manager at RTPI, so obviously at the heart of the debate about planning in the UK. James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Hello, everybody. And yeah, like Matthew says, this is, I think, a really important time for this discussion because we've got government both making really ambitious planning reform, and at the same time, we've got the environmental bill slowly making its way through Parliament. And, you know, given that we're in the midst of a housing crisis, economic crisis, climate, ecological crisis, a whole bunch of different ones, there's, I think, a really important role for environmental data in trying to get these kind of different processes all linked up. So what I'm going to do is give a quick overview of the proposals for planning reform, pose some questions about environmental data in the new system, set out a few of my concerns about the kind of direction of the reforms, and then suggest where I think we need to go from here. So yes, the white paper then, as I'm sure many of you will know, was published back in the autumn of last year. And it was kind of big on ideas, but light on detail, maybe more like a green paper. But one of the main kind of concepts in it is that local plans would designate land into three different categories. Growth areas would be for major development and automatically grant outline planning permission. Renewal areas would be areas for gentle densification, and protected areas would have a general presumption against development. The white paper was keen for local plans to be much shorter, and kind of says that the national planning policy framework would be expanded to become the primary source of kind of more rule-based planning policies. And then the kind of ideas that local authorities would kind of select from this big NPPF, tweak these policies in a very limited and prescribed way. And then with local policy and local plans scaled back, there'd be much more emphasis on using design codes, local design codes, to make developments beautiful and kind of fit with the local vernacular. Getting onto the kind of environment stuff, the white paper also proposed to abolish the sustainability appraisal process, which is the way that plans are tested against economic, social, and environmental criteria, and replace this with some kind of simplified process as yet to be set out. It also proposes to scrap the duty to cooperate, which is the mechanism for local authorities to work together on kind of cross-boundary strategic issues. It also proposed to create a new statutory sustainable development test for local plans when they get to the examination stage. And there's this kind of general ambition running through the white paper for local plans to be prepared following a standardized and much condensed timeframe, and also to be published in a standard digital template, with much more emphasis on visual presentation and the use of maps instead of just, tons of wordy words. So that's a little kind of whiz through some of the key points of the white paper. I'm now going to talk a bit about environmental data in the new system. Yes, that's the next slide. So yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that there's very little detail on how the reform system will actually deliver the ambitions of the 25-year environment plan or the environment bill. And the MHCLG is kind of working through these issues now and trying to weave together all these different moving parts. And we expect a new planning bill probably to be laid before Parliament at some point this year. But it's MHCLG, I get from my discussions with them, they're very bullish on the potential of better data and digital tools to enable this alignment between housing and development goals and our environmental goals, and to create a kind of rules-based planning system which can, enable us to have our cake and eat it on these types of issues. So I think for me, there are two kind of big outstanding questions, which we don't have enough details on yet, and I'll set up what those are. Firstly, we need to know what, if anything, is going to replace the duty to cooperate, because this mechanism is widely regarded as being too weak to support genuine cooperation on big issues like planning for the environment, infrastructure, and housing overspill. But if we want local plans to provide a really high degree of certainty for landowners, developers, and communities about what can and cannot take place on a given parcel of land, then in my opinion, you need some formal, robust mechanism to tackle these issues. When it comes to the environment and nature recovery, which are clearly strategic in nature, you need some way to get all the different stakeholders together in a way that enables them to have robust data on the current condition of the environment, existing land use designations, and models of future trends and opportunities for environmental enhancement. If you have agreement on the level of investment and activity needed to achieve, landscape scale objectives for nature, and you've agreed on those and you've cooperated on those kind of before the plan making process, then it becomes so much easier to test different patterns of planned growth against these objectives and decide what types of local planning policies are appropriate. So the government hasn't yet, hasn't ruled out that there might be some new form of strategic planning, but we know they're not super keen on returning to the old model of regional spatial strategies, which did consider environment and infrastructure in a nice joined up way. But whatever mechanism's chosen, I think environmental data will really need to underpin kind of early cooperation in planning. The second question is about the future of environmental assessment under the new system. We know the current system doesn't work particularly well, generates lots of kind of long, wordy consultancy reports rather than leading to good outcomes in many cases. But while streamlining, I think, seems like a good idea, again, it really depends on having robust environmental data and models to allow planners to assess different options at the plan making stage and make sure measures in place to mitigate these adverse impacts. So I think we await a DEFRA consultation on this to see what that new assessment process will look like. And again, there's a lot of tensions, I think, in the new system as well. There's tensions around speed versus sustainability. Can you speed up the plan making process while also actually doing all of that early stage engagement that we need to make sure that plans deliver genuine environment net gains? There's a tension in the kind of way we think about nature in protected areas versus growth and renewal areas. I think there's this kind of assumption in the white paper that nature kind of stops at these artificial boundaries, but obviously we know that nature is permeable. It sits above growth and renewal and protect areas, and we need a holistic model of planning that allows us to look at all of those in tandem and look at opportunities for environmental enhancement, both in triple SIs and greenbelt land and all that stuff, but also within the built up area, whatever that looks like. And thirdly, I think there's this tension between certainty and flexibility. There's this goal in the white paper for, again, much more upstream engagement in plan making, so that at the point of plan adoption, it provides, a clear set of rules and a clear understanding of what is permissible and not permissible on any given parcel of land. But again, I think that doesn't account for the fact that you only really understand what environmental impacts are going to be as the scheme moves to the more detailed design stage. And I think there's actually a lot of value in the current discretionary process for landowners, developers, planners, ecologists, etc., to come together in a kind of creative way and actually explore what the different options are for mitigating impacts and find more innovative and creative ways for solving those. Just on to the next slide then. So I'll just end with some kind of final thoughts about a possible way forward here. I think for me, it's not just about better data Oh yeah.
So we lost you for a second there, James, but
no worries.
only for a few seconds, I think.
I was just going to say that, yeah, it's not just about, I think, better environmental data in the new system, but also new models of governance to do stuff with that data, useful stuff. I think the white paper's ambitions for a kind of simpler rules-based planning system only works if we reform the way that we carry out strategic planning for the environment. At the moment, there's all these different plans and strategies for different environmental topics. You've got, air quality action plans, catchment management plans, shoreline management plans, tree and flood strategies, whatever it is. And these are often quite poorly integrated and administered and financed differently. So I think, that sometimes leads environmental issues to come into planning late in the day as a source of conflict, rather than something that's dealt with early on to provide a strategic direction for design solutions at a later stage. So I think we could do a lot to try and integrate these different environmental plans into perhaps a single local environmental plan, something which sets out corridors for environmental improvement, covers both urban and rural areas, direct spending from payments to farmers and payments from developers, that sort of thing. And then we also need some sort of strategic planning mechanism to integrate big landscape scale strategic plans for the environment with plans for the economy, industrial strategy, infrastructure, etc. So we can pull together in different investment streams and seek out opportunities for genuine environmental, social, and economic wins, rather than kind of perpetuating this language about trade-off between these different objectives. And with that kind of stuff in place, with that kind of good strategic governance in place, using data in a creative and kind of innovative way, that I think will then help to deliver the government's objectives for much simpler, streamlined local plans, and make sure that those plans can genuinely test different growth options and regeneration options against wider strategies for the environment. And again, get us to the point where we're delivering genuine net gains, not just seeking to mitigate adverse impacts or have trade-off between these different interconnected pillars. So yeah, data is going to be really critical about this. I'm super interested to hear what the other speakers have to say, so I'll stop for now. But yeah, hope that was interesting and look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, James. That was a really comprehensive introduction to the issues, and I'd very much agree with your point about the need for some sort of structure above the local level, and the abolition of the duty to cooperate seems a little bit sort of counterintuitive against that, doesn't it? I think a lot of the debates around decarbonisation of heat and transport happen at above local level, and that's going to be a challenge. Okay, our second speaker is Suki Ko. Suki is a Director for Town Planning at the consultancy Jacobs. Suki, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. Just a little bit about me. I'm the head of the town planning team at Jacobs. We are a large international, multinational global company, and we work on large scale infrastructure projects across a number of sectors, highways, energy, water, and rail. And I want to really talk about and to highlight some of the issues I see for the future and the opportunities for digital and the use of digital as I see them. Can I have my next slide? Thank you. So the issues for me really relate to these three main bullets. There are lots more, but I've focused on three. We are living through incredibly challenging times, and the demand for housing remains unmet. The high street and town centres are undergoing seismic changes, and climate change continues to be the single most important local and global issue. So to address these issues, we need accurate real-time data, and it must be at the heart of our decision-making. The Planning White Paper highlighted the need for greater use of digital technology that's easily accessible, open to all, and results in improved understanding of the issues that we're facing and trying to address. It's recognised that there is a plethora of platforms, processes, and available information across the planning piece and the environmental sources of information, and that this requires simplification and commonality. COVID, we can't avoid it. COVID has brought new and old issues to the fore. The movement online for retail, our working life, conferences like this, family and friends will change how people live in urban and rural places. Our need for infrastructure and technology, I believe, has changed permanently. Temporary legislation that was put in place at the beginning of the pandemic has to some extent postponed matters for consideration. For example, How can we complete traffic modelling for representative traffic flows to allow air quality assessments, noise assessments anytime soon? How can we understand the impact of air quality on ecological receptors without relevant data? Surveys were delayed under the emergency legislation, and it allowed decisions to continue. But now we need to move those developments forward and allow them to proceed. But what is the baseline? What is normal? And finally, the collection of data has always been a challenge. Capacity and technology within local authorities and the public sector is very varied. Some data is digitized and some is not. For example, tree preservation orders and common land designations are rarely digitized. Some of it's kept in paper ledgers, some of it is plotted manually on a map, and some of it is spatially recorded, but not necessarily well calibrated. I remember finding a tree preservation order located in the middle of the River Thames not that long ago. Capacity within councils to get on top of their data is limited. That's not what they're there for. And even more so under the current situation with staff deployed during the pandemic and potentially redeployed to other tasks for many months to come. They will have a backlog of work that they will need to address. Next slide, please. So we've begun to look at some ideas of how can we reduce the demand for data? What can we do to automate the process? How can we make data more easily available, ensure it's up to date, relevant and reliable for decision makers? So at Jacobs, we have a mantra that we collect data once and we use it many, many times. So for example, committed development is a bugbear of many infrastructure projects. What is planned, what is consented, but you can't actually see yet, what will be built by the time our projects actually land on the ground. This information is needed for traffic modelling, cumulative effects assessments within EIA, options assessments, land valuations, actually physically understanding what will be in the way if we propose something as planned. The presentation of that data, traditionally it's kept in large spreadsheets, which is not easily accessible. So we have worked to make our data more accessible. We've looked at presenting the information spatially. Improving public access to that information means the public can engage in the process better. They may well have been campaigning for many years to stop a particular allocation. If we don't show it on our plans for a new road, it doesn't explain why the bypass goes where it does. We need to be able to help the public to understand and see the information they're aware of and additional information. This can help stakeholders to understand the context of the place, how we use places now and into the future, their natural, social and economic value, and to help stakeholders to view across data sets to help us to move away from looking in silos. Jacobs has introduced a digital planning tool. It's not very whizzy, but it sounds great and will make a big difference. It is basically a tool to harvest application data on a weekly basis using a computer program, which is used often in other industries, particularly in finance. It's suitable for easily repeatable tasks, and it improves the timeliness and accuracy of the data. Importantly for us, it's not limited to a study area. So the project, as it changes and new options come available, the data is already available. We don't have to start again. Infrastructure projects, though, do face a challenge. They may take 20 years from start to finish, or even longer. And so keeping data up to date is a real challenge. It needs to be relevant, and as it changes, we need to be able to track versions and also to track the implications of those changes. Data platforms across the country are so varied. From our perspective, standardizing platforms as proposed in the white paper will be very, very welcome. But in the short term, it has meant that some of the development of our tools has had to slow down because we don't want a Betamax versus VHS situation. And I apologize to those in the audience who don't understand what on earth I mean. But basically, we don't want to develop our tool based on a technology that isn't the proposed front runner for the single platform and therefore lead to an obsolescent tool. So there is a balance between wanting to get on and help and mean that we can secure the data accurately and quickly, and also the need to just make sure we back the right horse. Next slide, please. But the case for digital has, from my perspective, never been stronger. But it needs to be more than just electronic, more than just sharing a document. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be dynamic. A further development at Jacobs is therefore looking at what would a fully digital EIA look like. It would use digital data, digital survey information. If we're collecting survey information, why put it on a piece of paper? Why not keep it in that digital format? Real-time assessment. We're developing a tool that has a central hub for all our information, for the baseline data, project details, design information, stakeholder inputs, and the assessment is presented by location and theme. So information is more accessible and relevant, and it can be presented based on the stakeholder or the decision maker's requirements. It will allow for interaction with material. So for example, a wildlife trust on a 97-kilometre pipeline can identify their sites and see all the information that relates to those sites and the associated assessment. Or a decision maker would be able to pick a theme, let's say air quality, and draw out all the data and assessment across the whole project and see the areas of impact and mitigation. And for me as a planner, the most important is that a local resident would be able to identify their property and see the relationship of a project in relation to the design of the project, the assessment of the impacts, and the mitigation that's proposed. I believe that would be a really powerful tool. The material is proposed to be live during the project and accessible during the project. Stakeholders would be able to see real-time information and also the iterative process that environmental assessment, data, and valuation can lead and bring to a project and make it develop in a different way. They'd also be able to see their inputs and how they've been taken into account, or if not taken into account, the reason and justifications for why that is the case. The final output of this virtual tool would be a virtual report, effectively the complete assessment presented in the same dynamic environment and able to be interrogated. So imagine a development consent order examination, and the theme for a particular virtual examination might be the impact of a project on great crested newts. The examining authority would be able to see very quickly and present to anyone in the room or not in the room, maybe they'll be online like this, all the information that relates to great crested newts across a large infrastructure project. They'd be able to see what the different approaches are across that project to the mitigation and the management of those issues. They'd be able to understand when and where in terms of seasons and the construction and operation of that project, the great crested newt issue would be addressed. We believe that would be a really powerful tool to have available, and we're looking forward to developing it further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suki, and some really interesting points there about particularly impact of COVID on baselines and what that means was something I hadn't thought too much about before. So the third and last speaker is Piers Edgell, who's a director at Landmark Information. Piers, over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, all, and thank you also to Suki and James for your insightful presentations. I'm acutely conscious that it's just me and a few questions between yourselves and enjoying your lunches. So I thought I'd keep my presentation at quite a high level, following on from Suki and James's. My name is Piers Edgell. I'm a client director at a company called Landmark Information, where I specialise in looking after environmental and engineering consultancy businesses. So next slide. Just for those who haven't come across Landmark, we are in essence a prop tech and envirotech innovation company. We've been at the very forefront of providing geospatial data and information into the UK's property market and allied services since 1995. And we've grown to become a very sort of large, sort of strong, competent business. We've got over 1,000 people now working within the business, and we're securely backed by a Daily Mail General Trust, a large stakeholder. And we're involved in basically everything to do with land in the UK, from speculative evaluation of a site through to the more detailed site investigation. We're involved through the planning process, through architects and planning consultants, right into construction, valuation and sale of those buildings, right the way back round full circle to redevelopment. We also work extensively with the government and also public sector. And Suki mentioned, mentioned in the questions I saw, Magic. That's the service that we sort of host on behalf of the government. So a little bit about us. Next slide. And just a little bit about me. I came to work at Landmark because I'm a geographer. Sure, that means I'm sort of competent with a set of colouring pencils, but it also means that spatial science is sort of where my sort of interests and skill sets lie. So next slide. Spatial science, I promise I'd sort of keep this really sort of simple, but in essence, it's looking at the world around us and seeing how we can sort of break it down. So looking at physical factors such as size, terrain, climate, resources, also social, cultural, demographic, economic and political factors. They all converge and have converged and basically influence human activity upon the landscape as we see it today. Basic theories have evolved, and these sort of help to explain sort of how we've got to where we've got to, and this helps determine how towns, how entire regions, and indeed how entire countries have sort of structured themselves. So next slide. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because the UK is quite an extraordinary case study, just from a sort of geoscience perspective. With my geography hat on, we've got some pretty unique challenges ahead of us. Economically, we're ranked 5th in the world. And with such a strong economy, naturally, it's going to attract people into it, wanting to live here. And also businesses are going to want to expand and sort of grow and capitalize on it. Area-wise, however, we are very geographically constrained, and the UK itself represents just 1/50th of a percentage point of the total land mass on the planet, and that's being generous. So we're a tiny sort of pinprick of a country in relative terms. Yet population, a figure of 68 million people, we represent just under 1% of the world's total population. So a lot of people in a very small constrained place. And that leads to sort of issues around sort of density. We're 280 people per square kilometre, which on face value sounds reasonably bearable and puts us, I think, 32nd in the world. But distribution is massively skewed by those physical factors that I mentioned earlier, also by social and economic factors which have been working through history. And it basically has resulted in 83% of our population of 68 million actually being focused in urban areas. So massive pressures within those. And within those urban areas take up only 25% of our land area. So 75% of land is either rural, used for farming, or undevelopable. So there's immense pressure on the land. We've got some real issues ahead in sort of managing continued economic growth, but doing so in a sustainable way and without compromising in any way the environment. So next slide. So coming round to the Future of Planning white paper, a very welcome step forwards, as alluded to by the other speakers, in terms of its general aims and particularly the ambitions with regards to digital technology. It does represent a significant shift from the way data has been gathered and sort of being made available. But it's not comprehensive and not detailed enough, and it needs to be some sort of meat put onto the bones. Landmark, we provided a formal response to the white paper and put forward some recommendations. And I've included just some sort of key points from that, along with some of my own, which I'll share with you this afternoon. So first of which is that planning matters. Planning really matters. Planning policy is a significant investment vehicle in any country. It affects the choices that individuals and businesses make. Domestic planning policy is every bit as important to the UK's prosperity as global trade deals and indeed any other global political alliances. And as James alluded to earlier, planning, we've had lots of noise in the past and then it all sort of fizzles out and we don't seem to sort of get anywhere or make any real progress. It's rather been half-hearted and sort of lacked the teeth that it's needed. So as a country, we should be investing in all aspects of planning properly and putting the right incentives and the mechanisms within place. And positive outcomes have already been touched upon, not just about promoting favourable economic outcomes, but also helping to facilitate those positive environmental outcomes, decarbonising and sort of mitigating environmental impacts. But very little guidance of late in planning policy as to how that might, how to sort of build all the new houses. It means that it's really been left to market forces and therefore following paths of least resistance. And unfortunately, over the last couple of years, and I've observed it through much of the work that my clients are putting to me, large swathes of UK's green fields have become victim of this kind of policy. It's incredibly questionable practice against backdrops of broad agendas we have on sustainability, net environmental and sort of biodiversity gains I mentioned a moment ago. And there's massive resources that are untapped. The CPRE has estimated that there's about 18,000 brownfield sites dotted around the country, providing almost 26,000 hectares of land that's developable. That's nearly enough land for more than a million homes. Better still, sorry, excuse me a second, just need some water. Better still, all these brownfield sites have existing communications and infrastructure links that are actually already in place. And at very worst case, will require just an upgrade or some repurposing. So it's far more cost effective as well as being sustainable rather than putting those kind of infrastructures in afresh. And consolidation, there's some great examples of digital initiatives that are out there that are helping to unlock opportunity within brownfield development. The Scottish Land Commission has created an amazing interactive derelict land map. The University of Wolverhampton has created an interactive scoping tool to enable developers to evaluate parcels of brownfield lands to sort of prioritise them. But these great efforts, they need to be extended out so that they're national and also sort of consolidated so that a greater audience can sort of benefit from them. And as a business, we've captured many data sets on a national basis. We've digitized local plans, planning applications, current amenity information, and land use. So it's not inconceivable that building upon that and with a few extra data sets, we could sort of look to create a tool that helps us to knit together all this information so we can unlock brownfield opportunities properly, and that those can be sort of incorporated into planning policy moving forwards. And just a couple of just additional ones to add in there. I mean, future-proofing, looking at carbon reduction of existing housing stocks. We've got access to information from thermal imaging information from satellites, which could potentially be used to look at ineffective insulation on buildings, so we could look to either address that issue or actually rebuild. Flood risk is a massive challenge within this country along with climate change, and flood together with erosion risk is again another data set which we do well to sort of benefit from at earlier stages in the planning process. And Suki mentioned COVID. I mean, it has had an effect on our lives. How it affects us, the way we live and work in future, remains to be seen. But this information is very easy to sort of model and could be built into the way we make planning decisions moving forwards. So in terms of standardization, outcomes that are being outlined in the white paper will only happen if we can sort of standardize data and do things better. So it means out with these sort of individual silos and in with aggregated data, with standardization of formats, validation of data, and making sure that it's all maintained and kept current and with suitable licensing so that it can be shared across other softwares and platforms. As complex as this might seem, the actual data and technical capabilities required to deliver a framework are already in existence, and we've built a business off doing this very thing. Thank you. Next slide. So really, in conclusion, in my opinion, data and technology are absolutely key to creating the planning vision that's set out in the planning white paper. We already understand so much about how we've got to be where we're already at. With digital technology at the very heart of the planning system, we can effectively take what we know, add into it what we need to achieve, and ensure that we're able to make the very best planning decisions for now and for many years to come. Effectively, a reversal of the model that I showed you earlier, with data sort of driving the end output. Really very much look forward to seeing what happens with the white paper and in terms of the progression of the digital agenda. And as a business, we'd welcome the opportunity to explore all possibilities with government and other parties so that the full benefit of digital can be unlocked. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Piers. So we've got a good 20 minutes or so for questions. Lots and lots of different sort of issues thrown up by our panelists, so lots of things we could pick up on. I've seen a couple of questions come through in the chat, but just while we allow other people to put questions in chat as things occur to them, I'll maybe kick off. Let's pick up on the point you made, Suki, about the VHS versus Betamax issue, which I certainly do remember well. So this question about, it must make sense to try and standardize the platforms and make them sort of interoperable, I guess, but that can actually hold up innovation. James, you're probably way too young to remember VHS Betamax, but I'm sure you've got some thoughts on the question here.
Yeah, I remember VHSs, so Betamax must have been right before that. Is that how it worked? Yeah, I don't know. This is something we've been looking at a bit at the RTPI with the Connected Places Catapult as well, the government's kind of innovation arm, I guess, for the built environment. And yeah, you know, because this is something that we see happening not just in, you know, we're not just talking about getting more environmental data into planning, but data on infrastructure performance and the economy and the nature of our high streets and all that stuff. And I think over the last, since I've started getting interested in kind of digital planning, it seems to me that the government's, the English government's approach to digitizing planning has been kind of a little hands-off, I suppose. It's kind of, you know, let's see what innovation bubbles up from the private sector and from the public sector as well. You know, lots of local authorities have come up with their own in-house solutions. And that's been really, really positive. And, you know, the example from Jacobs, great. There's really good ones I've seen from ACOM and from, you know, all the big consultancies have been really grasping this agenda. And yeah, genuinely excellent innovation. I suppose my kind of, I don't know if it's really a concern, but it's kind of the question of at what point do we assess what's gone well and the kind of state of innovation, and then have government kind of swoop in and turn some of this into a standardized approach that works for the country as a whole. Because I suppose my only concern is we might get to a point where individual local authorities are buying and locking themselves into 5-10-year contracts for a particular tech platform or solution. The neighboring local authorities on a totally different one, and neither system speaks to the other one properly. And so, yeah, it's a real tricky question of kind of, you know, million flowers bloom innovation from down under kind of thing versus the government doing a big tech approach. And I guess historically, government tech solutions haven't always gone as planned. So it's, yeah, I think we probably are at the point now where I would expect to see a bit more of a standardized approach roll out. And I suppose the middle ground for some of this stuff, I think, is that, you know, maybe for a lot of these things, we don't need a single national data platform for pulling in environmental data. Maybe actually the best scale at which to do it is at more kind of functional economic geographies. So perhaps, you know, having Greater London Authority or Greater Manchester Combined Authority have kind of purchasing and procuring tech platforms for analyzing this kind of data for a bunch of local authorities, rather than a single national solution or a whole bunch of different local solutions. So I think there might be some kind of middle ground there. But yeah, I mean, CLG is very actively exploring this stuff, and I know they're talking to DEFRA frequently. So I think there is a lot of potential to take private sector innovation and kind of scale it up now at the national level. And the Scottish government's a really good place to look for this. The Scottish government is rolling out a more comprehensive digital planning strategy for the country as a whole. So maybe that's the kind of thing we need now for England.
Yeah, I guess the scale is maybe a bit more manageable in a Scottish context to do these sorts of things, isn't it? Suki, I mean, you raised this point, and I guess sort of, you know, what James is saying is, well, two thoughts, I suppose, that, you know, sooner or later, perhaps the government has to sort of freeze the innovation at maybe a suboptimal point just to allow that sort of comparability, and also the idea you maybe do it at regional level. As a company in the thick of all this, what's your what's the answers? No easy answers.
There are no easy answers. I think to try to be ambitious and say common platform, everyone does the same thing the same way, is not really going to be deliverable. You know, we have a market-based economy, and you know, local authorities need to be able to have some flexibility. But I think, therefore, the better way may be that there has to be some standardized elements of that data and that data platform. That means that there can be harvesting of that data, that the data is understood to follow standardized coding, standardized ways in which it is stored, that shape files, which are the bane of my life, are common, that people have used a common and standardized set of rules. Their platform may be different, but it means that you can actually gather that data because you understand how it's been put together and how it's been stored and how its granularity is arranged and organised. And I think that's possibly more achievable than saying everyone must use Marks and Spencer's product, because I don't think that's actually ever going to really work politically, locally, nationally, etc. So I think that it's about the set of rules under which data is collated and made available more than actually the platform. And that was the issue that I picked up from the white paper, was it absolutely talking about a common platform, and I'm not sure that's achievable.
Piers, you mentioned standardization in one of your final slides. What's your take on this?
Well, I think standardization is, to my mind, it is achievable, not necessarily sort of entirely through the sort of private sector, but I think if we get the right drive coming from the actual sort of government itself, then I think things can sort of be moved. One of the speaking with environmental sort of consultants, one of the greatly missed websites is What's in Your Backyard, or What's in My Backyard, where a lot of information is pulled together on one nice, easy to use interactive map. It sort of seems strange how we're sort of almost calling for something whereby information is all pulled together on a national basis, yet actually not that long ago the Environment Agency sort of pulled the plug on that because it was too costly to maintain. Interestingly, Magic is it's a great platform, but it's only come about and because it's been sort of requested, and Landmark have sort of put that platform together, and we manage it and sort of run it. But I suppose my point is that the private sector can't do stuff. We can't do out for out. There's got to be some sort of directive, someone sort of driving it, and if not sort of government or MHCLG, then well, who?
Okay, thank you. And I've seen a couple of comments come up in the chat about this, so interested in people's thoughts on this sort of that question. I guess there's a sort of linked thought I had, which is, environmental issues are hugely wide-ranging, hugely complex, and I think we're at a time where policymakers and the government are keen to be seen to be addressing pretty much environmental issue, whether it's carbon, net zero, biodiversity, air quality, circular economy, sort of all at once. And in terms of the planning system, is it that is the challenge we don't have enough data on a lot of these topics, or actually we have too much data and the issue is perhaps more about we can't access it or it's not compatible or whatever? So too much data or too little data? James, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I would probably lean on the kind of we've got plenty of data, but it's the knowing what to do with it part. I mean, part of the rationale for government in the planning white paper proposing to strip away sustainability appraisal is that, from my understanding, that practice has become dominated by it's become very kind of process driven. So it's kind of crunching the data in order to arrive at a kind of defensible position should things end up in court, rather than trying to achieve perhaps genuinely good environmental outcomes. And it's a very expensive and can be a very time consuming process as well, but they're packed full of data, so there's really good nuggets of information in there. I think so when it comes to using data to do good planning, I think what has been missing again, which I alluded to in my presentation, is the vision and the strategy for what we're trying to achieve for given places. Again, when we're talking about environment, kind of landscape scale visions and objectives, because if you have a good understanding of what they are, and you have very accurate, robust data on the particular environmental characteristics of a certain site, that helps you to link those two things up. When you think about developers now being required to demonstrate biodiversity net gain, you can have plenty of data on the current biodiversity value of the site and perhaps what is achievable on that site, but you need to be able to know whether it's best for the developer to max out biodiversity enhancements on that particular little nugget of land, or actually to perhaps make a payment to deliver a much wider set of environmental objectives somewhere else ideally not too far away from where the site is, but kind of, you know, to help to deliver a landscape restoration project that is, you know, perhaps in the neighboring local authorities. So that's not so much a question of, well, data is really important to both of them, but it's more about the right mechanisms to make sure that we are spending what is always kind of limited cash in the most effective way, I suppose. And so that's kind of why I always get, well, it might just be my personal interest, but I always get more interested on that kind of governance and where's the plan for what we're trying to achieve, and then the data helps you understand what the best use of everybody's resources is. But again, I must come clean. I'm not an environmental data specialist, so very happy to hear what other people have to say.
So a couple of comments in chat saying you've got that right. Suki, what's your take on that?
Well, sitting at the consenting end of the planning arguments, I think that there is a certain amount of skepticism about how much data is used and how much projects hide behind it. And I think that for us, the real key is making it clear, open, less opaque, much more transparent about what the data is and how it's being used. So, example, working on a road scheme, the collection of data using mobile phones caused a huge amount of anxiety in the local population, partly because they thought that they didn't have mobile phones, so the data was full of holes, not recognising that there are all sorts of other elements of the data as well, and it was only one line of the collection of data about the use of a road network, broader road network. So it is about sharing that information, helping people to understand what it is, not necessarily more or less, but just being much more transparent about how it's used, why it's used, and what it's trying to say. And so from our perspective, trying to help have more information that can be interrogated by the individuals who maybe are skeptical will be helpful in tearing back and revealing what we're really using the data for and why.
You're muted, Matt.
Had to be done sooner or later, didn't it? Just to pick up that point, Suki, and I remember you mentioned in your presentation about, you know, the most important sort of person perhaps looking at the data is the person trying to identify their property and how their area might be affected. And the government in the white paper, you know, puts a lot of emphasis on, you know, giving people access to understanding this sort of data will, you know, I suppose, make it easier to build consensus around sort of planning decisions. How far do we have to go in delivering that in terms of, you know, is it about making the data interactive? Is it just trying to open it up? Is there an issue about helping people interpret data? Because, you know, we've all worked on issues where there's just so much data, it's hard to, well, either both sides of the argument just pick bits of data that suit their purposes perhaps as well. Are there lots of examples of good practice we can draw on, and is there a need to standardize that, or again, should we let local authorities and developers sort of, you know, try different approaches?
So I think that we've come a long way actually from ye oldie-fashioned drafty village hall with a piece of paper saying, what do you think of this, to something that is much more interactive. And certainly during COVID, we've had to still keep going with public engagement events, and we've run digital events, and people have found them very, very helpful. And I think that there is a certain amount of helping and guiding users to understand what you're showing and why and what it's about. So even our digital events, it's important to have the expert, or the not so much of an expert, but the interpreter maybe, around to be able to explain and give guidance and encouragement about what you're seeing and what it means and why it means what it does is really important. So there's more to go, a lot more to go. But we also need, I think, to remember that the younger generation are much more whizzy on this stuff than I am. Certainly, I'm of an age. And we need to also help the older generation to still be able to access and engage in this. So the use of libraries, the use of technology that is portable. I've recently been working on a project where we've actually been taking iPads to people's homes who can't get to events or can't manage to understand what's online, and actually, outside COVID, visiting them and walking them through where their property is, where the development is, how it works, what the interactions are, what the assessment's taken into account, how it will operate, how it will be constructed. Using something that is really interactive has really helped people to understand. They still don't like it. Let's not pretend that this is going to be a magic wand, but nevertheless, their increased understanding. And actually, the good thing was they will also hold the developers' feet to the flame. You said, I was there, you said you'd do this, you would mitigate this, you showed me, now do it. Why aren't you? You know, so it's a two-way thing. And I think that's all going to be for the benefit of helping to get projects moving forward, development happening, economic recovery, etc.
Just make sure I'll mute myself there. Piers, is your company, is Landmark involved at all in public engagement, or your clients are? How do you see it?
We aren't, but our clients are. And I think just listening to Suki talking a moment ago, I think it's really about having the right data for the right person at the right time. We've got I suppose a core kernel of data in our database, and we pump it out in a slightly different format, sort of tailored according to who the audience is. A report that a house buyer might buy will be different to a report that an engineer will buy in terms of the levels of detail. But the key thing about it is that because it's all come from the same source, the two can sort of link up. And I think that's where the transparency comes in, and making sure that it's all sort of feeding off the same iteration of the sort of source data, and making sure it is sort of presented in a fit purpose for who's going to be using it.
Okay, thank you. So we're nearly out of time, just the last couple of minutes. Huge topic. Let's just finish with 30 seconds from each panelist in the time-honored tradition of what's the one thing that we should focus on. Lots of different things that as the government fleshes out the detail of the planning reforms and we all engage with them, different things they could put the effort into first, but what's the one thing you'd like to see prioritised? Let's start, James, with yourself.
So many things you could say. Probably, I'm a big fan of any kind of digital tool that allows you to layer all of the different maps for how land is used. Flood risk maps, transport infrastructure maps, site allocation maps, whatever it is. Just genuinely, just a single platform where you can turn them on and off is super valuable, because then when you do that engagement and you get all those people around the table, you've got a thing that allows them to see the thing they care about alongside all the things that everyone else is caring about. And it's such a useful decision-making tool and figuring things out tool. So yeah, kind of interactive layered maps I'm a big fan of.
That's good. Piers?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely the same. Interactive layered maps are definitely the way forward, and can help sort of demystify things that are otherwise sort of quite impenetrable. If one explains what a GIS is, it's met with sort of strange looks. Whereas actually, if you just say that it's showing where something is relating to a place, then people understand that. People understand a map. They don't understand these sort of abstracted notions of the data that actually goes into it.
That speaks a geographer. Suki, last word to you.
Communication. It's not education, but it's just using data to communicate to people and to allow people to understand. Then they can be informed and make comments on things that are happening in their places from an informed position. That's where we want to get to.
Okay, well, thanks. We're pretty much out of time now. Thank you to all our panelists, to James, to Suki and to Piers. Many thanks to all of you for listening. Hope you found it enjoyable. We're going to send out a recording of the webinar to everyone who registered. So if you enjoyed it, you can watch it all over again or share it with colleagues. We've got quite a few more webinars upcoming. On the screen now, you can see a list of the webinars being run by our sister organisation, ACE, and they're open to any EIC members. We've also got some plans for a webinar to continue the sort of smart tech theme we've touched on today, and to compare and contrast the approach of Scandinavia and the UK in terms of using smart city tech to tackle environmental issues. So look out for that one when we publish a date of it. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you for listening.